You know, I started to write this speech about grand challenges in the park. I was in Trinity Bellwoods Park. And as I was starting to write, the voice of a man carried to me on the wind who was yelling at himself, angry at himself. And I thought to myself, that's one. And for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to keep it together. It's nervous work, this kind of thing. The stakes are high. There's a lot of good people here, a lot of really great ideas. But there's one thing that you learn early in your emergency training is if you panic, do it on the inside. Don't do it on the outside. So far, so good. One of the things I practice, this is a talk about practice, I guess. Practice makes practiced, never perfect. And one of the things I practice is emergency medicine, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. Another is I worked in Sudan and wrote a book about it. I'm not sure how many of you know, but there's a war just started there. That's never really left, actually. You know, our newest country, our newest war, and that's another grand challenge. You know, I'd like to get to know you guys a little bit better. I'll ask you a couple questions. Who knows who Dambisa Moyo is? She's a Zambian economist. Raise your hands. She said basically, large transfers of aid money from government to government don't necessarily diminish poverty, they perpetuate it. Now, who knows who Willie Sutton is? Willie Sutton. He's a famous bank robber, right? When asked, Willie, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. Now, who knows they're both talking about the same thing? The reason why the money doesn't make it to the hands of the people is there's people who know where the money is, right? But that book about Sudan is about those kind of injustices. And when I worked there in that war that never left, it took the breath out of that place, out of that small town, like a forest fire. It takes the air out. It takes a lot of energy to go to war, a lot of hatred and a lot of fear. And it takes a lot of courage to stand weaponless before it. Some of my friends are there right now. I wish I was with them. They're brave, and they're the ones that change the world. I wonder if I do. I mean, maybe I have by standing there with them, but I wonder if I do by standing here telling stories. I'm not so sure about that. You know, no matter, I don't know if stories change the world, no matter how full they are of action. A semantics professor, Irving Lee, he's a professor, he's since died, but he starts his semester by holding up a matchbox and saying to his class, what is this? And eventually someone says a matchbox, and he says, matchbox is just a noise. And so are these words that are leaving my mouth, and no matter how sweet the sound of the sentence that offers help, nothing will ever beat the hand that pulls somebody up. Still, it is my sincere pleasure to be here and talking to you. You know, I find in this kind of dialogue that happens on days like this, I find answers about how to live more authentically myself, and I really value it and treasure the opportunity. But for me, I'm just curious, like, how is this on anyone's radar? Why do people care and gather to talk about ideas like this? Because from my experience from working in places like that need the most help, it's fairly lonely business. That's what makes the return so jarring. You're like, where were you guys? There's crazy over there. You need so much help. Or do you just like the stories? I've been a curious witness of the story in health evolve over the past 15 years since I first stepped off the plane into a vastly different landscape of sickness than the one I was being trained in. It was in Santiago, Chile, and I worked in the public system, and I watched families try to pay for their grandfather's surgery by borrowing a dozen MasterCards from their friends, and, well, the poor people just died. And I realized that if I could look forward to some privilege in Canada as a physician, it was because I took care of the sick ones, and it didn't matter where, and it didn't matter when. It didn't matter if it was on a plane, it didn't matter if it was in the middle of the night. But the sickest people seem to be in other places. How could they be so sick? So sick there and so comparatively well here. So what was an interest, what was a curiosity became an interest, and from that a focus, and from that a career. And over that time, I've watched with interest as school children understand that the world is an ecosystem in a way that my zoology professors struggled to explain. And, geneticists and economists and apiarists all agree that there's complete interdependence at all levels, that nothing is immune in this system from another part that ails it. Nothing. It's all deeply interconnected. So that question about how to do the best we can for as many people as possible is a vital one, because, in that real way, none of us is free until all of us are free. I would say that we all seek something individually, personally, and buzz around it like a moth would a bright light. And how honest we are with what we truly seek is how close we come to finding it. And I would say that what that is freedom. Freedom to connect with the source of all things, to let love move through you freely without reproach. And I think that is what the grandest challenge speaks to. And that is why we get people well. And though the work is often at the level of a particular disease that holds someone sick in bed, it must also be with equal force at the barriers that stand in the way of them doing it for themselves. That the injustices that let the suffering of so many serve the purposes of so few and holds people down just like their malaria does. For me, the largest example of this as a witness is in war. It wastes away a country like a chronic disease would. And my first experience was in Cambodia, and I went there as a brand new medical resident, so wet behind the ears I'd leave a trail, And I worked with this isolated population of Khmer Rouge who just surrendered, and they were starving and malarious. They'd been given a hectare of land on conditions of their surrender. And my plan was to go there for a month and do clinics in the morning and spend the afternoon finding their, what their challenges, why they were so sick. And for my arrival, there was a party. I showed up in this valley with a borrowed Land Cruiser and a borrowed translator, and there was this party underneath this hut set up high on sticks, and people were making food for me that I knew that they could scarcely afford. And at the same time, a car was coming the other way, a truck, and they stopped and said something in Khmer, and my translator turned to me and said, "They want to know if you want to see this woman now or you want to start tomorrow." And I went around the back and I found this woman. She was, 60, old for that area, right? And she was bleeding from her mouth and her nose, and she had a fever, and she was barely conscious. And I said, with a certainty I didn't have, take her to the hospital. I'll see her tomorrow. I just wanted one more day of reprieve, right? Because I was so overwhelmed already. But I learned a lot during that month, about war and what it does to people, and how to do medicine for as many as possible with as little at hand. This big trunk of medicines and equipment that I took there, and it was the size of like a refrigerator turned on its side. But by the time I left, I was working with a kit that was the size of a lunchbox, just full of essential medicines and antimalarials and multivitamins and paracetamol.